So this is the second talk of the series, Jerusalem and Athens, God-centered versus human-centered governance. It's the second, and I expect it to be the final installment of this series. So to recap what we discussed, the problem we set out for ourselves in the first talk, we discussed that there are two methods, two theories, political theories of political science of how to achieve the ideal human society, which is the most important question on the mind of human beings. And the two approaches were, let's start with the Torah's approach, which is Ha'aretz Asher Areka, the land I will show you, which means that Abraham and his descendants were charged with learning how to view the world from God's perspective. So to think about, to consider what is important to God, what he cares about, and to be inspired by that, and to model the city of man on the city of God, or to make it into the city of God, let's say. And then we juxtaposed that to the philosophical approach, which is very rich and very powerful, and says that human beings should consider each other, and people should view their identity as being a part of a polis, a part of a society to which they contribute by modifying their behavior in a way that they achieve cooperation with fellow humans. And the question we left with is, why do we need anything more than that? What does the Torah want? Why does it insist on human beings, who are ultimately human beings, thinking about something superhuman or something non-human? What is to be achieved by that, except for it's like a subversion of society, of the human order? I mean, what is to be achieved by humans thinking about something non-human, except for them not being true to themselves and therefore being disruptive of society, which parenthetically is a arguably a known side effect of misunderstanding the Torah. So the question is, well, what is the correct understanding of the Torah? Right? No, you don't. So what is the correct understanding of the Torah, and how is that not inevitably going to be the effect of the Torah? Okay, so we care about human good. Why should we think about God? What does that do for the human good? So we discussed at the end of the last talk, I think it was 4 or 5 different ways that we can perhaps reconcile this, but I want to focus on the one that I think is correct, which is to argue that this essentially is a false dichotomy. And my argument is as follows, that yes, indeed, all we care about is the human good. And the human good is achieved, as the philosophers taught and as the Rambam echoes, by all humans learning to consider the totality of human society and the virtue, the greatness of cooperation, the greatness of being part of a polis, a city. So that's one aspect of it. What the Torah teaches us is that we think of all that from the perspective of God. In other words, we don't leave it at the fact that they are human beings and human beings have a certain nature and that's the way it is, but rather we consider the humanity along with its nature as being God's work. So at this point, I just want to talk about those two extremes that we set forth. One was thinking of the world from God's perspective, and one was thinking about humans. And now I'm telling you that those are not really two different extremes. Why? Because let's say you think about the world from God's perspective. So you think about, what does God see? Well, what does he see if not for humans? Humans is the most important thing that he sees. Why? Because humans are the most important of his creations. So taking back, let's say, looking at this from the perspective of the first chapter of Genesis, which ends with Hashem seeing everything he made, and it was exceedingly good, and that's after the creation of man. Okay, so the creation of man is when God looks, and that's when it says he sees that everything is exceedingly good. And the pasuk says that God saw v'hinei tov ma'od, about which Chazal say ma'od, the letters ma'od, mem, aleph, dalet are the same letters as Adam. So when does creation become exceedingly good? When man is created. So that is to say that, okay, you know what? I want to look at the world and see what God sees. Well, where should I look? Well, I should look at human beings. You know why I should look at human beings? Because if you want to understand reality, and I mean the totality of reality, the best place to look for that is to understand human beings. And this is something which I assert that we're now beginning to understand, the centrality of humans to the universe. It's actually very interesting historically. Once upon a time, they thought the universe was pretty small, and that humans were at the center, geocentric model. And that was, of course, important for this religious idea that humans are the crown of creation. And then there's this tension because the heliocentric model says, look at that, humans are not the center of the universe. Maybe humans are not so important and the world is not about God and his relationship with humanity, right? But science actually has now caught up and recognizes, and I don't mean to say our simple knowledge, recognize that human beings are in fact the center of the universe in the sense that the fate of the universe depends on human beings. This is something that we're realizing more and more with modern technology. We're realizing how the most important factor for anything in the universe is what humans are going to do. And this, David Deutsch in his book, The Beginning of Infinity, makes an excellent case for this. That, you know, he argues against, let's say, the reductionist approach to society where like everything is atoms, right? You know, to predict anything, you just want to know the course of atoms. So he just basically makes this kinds of, shows you how the most determining factor for anything is actually not the course of a particular atom, but it's rather people and what they think. And if you want to predict, he gives like some sort of example. There's some bottle of champagne in some lab somewhere, and if they solve a problem, they're going to uncork the bottle or something like that. And he says like this. He says, if you want to predict whether the cork is in the bottle or not, it doesn't help you to know the course of every atom. Because yes, eventually when the bottle is uncorked, it's going to be because a person goes and takes it. So there's going to be emotion, but really it depends on human thought. Okay, that's like a sort of an interesting example because it makes you realize how human thought is determined. We try to think of the world without humans. We try to think of the world like, okay, we observe the world, but actually we're a very big part of the world. Not only a very big part of the world, but the most critical part of the world. And he shows other things about like the fate of the solar system and the fate of the planet. Now we're understanding that, of course, human beings are indeed very critical. So then, let's say taking Areka, taking that verse, that pasuk that says, okay, what does it mean? How do we create a good society? So Hashem tells Avram, I want you to see things as I see it. And where do we find that God saw reality? In creation, in 6 days of creation. And the final seeing is when he sees all that he made, which is exceedingly good, and that's after the creation of man, and has that allusion to man because of the same letters. So then if you say, well, what does it mean to see the land as God sees it? Well, to focus on humanity is actually a very good idea. Okay, now let me explain exactly what I mean by that. But last time we spoke about it, I think we talked about seeing the totality of existence, and now I'm saying, see humanity. So, well, let's ask the question like this. If I'm only going to look at humanity, am I going to know, am I going to understand God's actions vis-a-vis the animal kingdom, let's say? So I'm saying, yes, I will. Why? Because the ultimate, to get back to that point, the ultimate fate of the animal kingdom depends on humans. So, you ought to take a point in time and say, what did God do? Okay, there's such amount of cows and such amount of lions and so on and so forth. But if you want to understand the real actions of God, you want to think about the future. You want to think about what's the long-term plan over here. So you want to think about, let's say, will the cow species have a thriving and successful, being, existence? So to answer that question, you really have to think about humans. How are we going to treat animals? Are we going to care for them, or are we going to destroy them? Maybe it's good to destroy them. I'm not taking a stance on that, but I'm saying ultimately everything hinges on the human being, which is basically saying free will. That's all ideas. A human being is at the end of creation, and all of creation hinges on him. But that's what it means. It means that now that human is created, if you want to understand what the world is from God's perspective, you have no other way to do that, no better way to do that than to think about what is the human. So the two aspects over here of whether we're focusing on humans or we're focusing on God's perspective are actually not as different as we first set them out to be. And I want to read a passage from the Guide of the Perplexed, where Moshe asked Hashem to see God, and God told him you can't see God, but he did show him, as the pasuk says, God showed him kol tuvi, and which is all of my goodness. I will make all of my goodness pass before you. What does it mean? What does it mean that Hashem showed him all of his goodness? Says the Rambam, all of my goodness alludes to the display to him of all existing things. That's what Moshe came to know. All existing things were displayed to Moshe. Why is all of my goodness called all of existence? Because about all of existing things it is said, and God saw everything that he has made, and behold, it was very good. So Moshe Rabbeinu's highest understanding, what the Rambam says that no one before him or after him ever achieved, was that he understood that that seeing of God, that seeing that God saw that it was all good. Moshe had that same experience. He was partnered with God in that visual experience, and he asked to see God. God said, you can't see me, but I will show you all of my goodness, the same thing that I, God, looked at, which is exceedingly good. And as we said, that's referring to man. So therefore, Moshe is having then a window into understanding the nature of man. And importantly, this is very timely, because now we're going into the days where we're going to be saying the Yud Gimel Midas. Moshe Rabbeinu has then learned the attributes, the characteristics of God, which teach us about the characteristics of man. That's the important thing. We'll get back to that. So the seeing man and seeing God and seeing all his goodness tells us something about character, about man's character, about what man is like, and also what man should be like, because obviously those two things are very related. Okay, and to put it very starkly, and this is something very important, we'll get back to this at the end of the talk, is God good or is God not good? So you say, well, sure, God is good because he does good things, right? Well, ultimately, let's say the jury is out, okay, without any religious belief, without any a priori knowledge. Okay, let's say I'll just ask you, let's assume there's a God and he created the world. That's all we know. Is it a good thing that he created the world or not? So I'd say, well, the jury is out. Why? Because we have to see what humans do. Okay? If we're judging God to be good based on his actions, i.e. creation, and the story of the world is far from complete, and how it ends is going to depend on whether humans are good. So to say God is merciful, for example, is true if humans are merciful. Because God's only merciful because he does merciful things. And the things that God did are only merciful if human beings, who are the lords of the world and determine the fate of the universe, will be moral and be merciful themselves. Okay? So let's say, just to give that a concrete example. It's not true that God is merciful if the end of this experiment called the universe, let's say, is that there's going to be a tyrant who's going to torture everyone to death and then torture himself to death. It's not. Then God is not merciful. So when we assert that God is merciful, essentially we're saying human beings are merciful, or will become merciful, at least in the long run. Don't get hung up on a point in time. Okay, any questions? Okay, so let's continue then. So the first point was then that there's not this dichotomy. There's a false dichotomy between talking about how God sees the world and how and a human-centric governance. Okay, God-centered, a human-centered governance, because ultimately, what God sees, as in what his perspective is, depends on the nature of humans themselves. So if we want to look for what is it that God is seeing, we have no better place to look than to say, well, what is a human being? So we should look into ourselves to see God. Yeah, what's the question?
I just want to clarify this point, that it sounds like you're saying the purpose of creation was humanity?
I'm not saying the purpose of creation. I'm saying I'm trying to make an empirical observation, which is that the fate of creation and its quality of being a success or not hinges on morality, on morals, and whether humanity is going to be moral. Right? Because now that we have, nuclear weapons and whatever, all sorts of things. Okay? Examples required, or it's pretty clear, right? I mean, you just allow your imagination to understand. There's risks, there's existential risks to humanity. which are going to be overcome if we have the right midos, if we have the right morals, and will be abused, such as weapons of mass destruction, if we have the wrong kind of characteristics. So the moral good is determinative for the physical reality, and therefore the quality of all of being. Okay, so the two things are not different, but what's the point? In other words, what's the point of connecting this to God? Ultimately, we're saying that when we look at ourselves, when we do the philosophical move or the Greek move of saying, well, what's a human being? And there's all different types of human beings, and can we find a consensus human being or a medium human being? What we're doing is we're doing God's vision. Okay, maybe that's so, but what's the point of insisting on connecting it back to God and basically having a God consciousness and thinking, okay, we're doing what God is doing? Why don't we just say, look, this is what we are, and this is how it is, this is what things are. Why is it important to see things from God's perspective? Okay, so here's what I want to give you the answer. This is my approach. I think it's correct. The point is as follows. The point is what we achieve by bringing things back to God's perspective is that we are not married and stuck to any particular human way. In other words, we value the way of humans, but we value it because the way of humans is the action of God. So therefore, we are simultaneously valuing the way of humans and recognizing that humans are extremely important, and what humans are like is all there is in a certain way. But at the same time, it's only the way it is because that's how God wants it to be. That's what God is doing. And that is very important because that way we open ourselves up to the ability of progress and changing. So while we respect the way of the human, and what do I mean by that? Let's give that a specific form. A person who's extremely cruel, to take the example from the guy that we discussed last week, will learn to be merciful in order to be respectful of the polis, respectful of the fact that there's a human race of which he's a part, and he'll respect that determines what is right, humanity, humanness, human character. At the same time, he's also supposed to be aware of the fact that this is only God's way. You know what I mean? Only God's way. Because once we bring it back to God, that means that this is the way it is, but it could be different, and God might change his ways, which is to say, human beings might change. And let me explain exactly what I mean by that. There's a tension between what is and what can be, and this is a basic tension between progress and conservatism. Okay, in the notes over here, this is AI rendered this paragraph here, which you might recognize the style from chat. Basically, by just to bring out I just ask it to tell me what is the tension between. Okay, it's a basic idea. There's a tension between progressivism and conservatism. What's the tension? Tension is like this: either you honor and respect what is, because you have a respect for what is. Okay, what does it mean to respect what is? It's the same thing as saying it comes from God, essentially, in a certain way. Actually, that's one way to look at it, but let's take that back, okay? Either a person respects what is, he values what is, but if he does that, so what he gains is stability, but what he loses is the potential for perhaps something greater than he can fathom, or some sort of new order, which some innovation or something better, which conflicts with the current order. So what shall it be? Violent progressivism, which has no respect for the current order, or a dictatorial conservatism, which says we can't, authoritarian kind of conservatism, which says we can't change anything. This is a basic tension in human nature and political order. It's a sacrifice. To the extent that we're open to change, we're undermining what is, and the change might be worse than what is, right? And to the extent that the converse, if we say, listen, you have to respect the existing orders in society, then how do we achieve something better? So what I assert over here is that the Torah's solution for this, and this is what the purpose is of looking at things in God's perspective, is that we think of reality as simultaneously something to respect, but also something that can change, can be improved. Why? Because we respect the way things are, not because we take the way things are as being the way they must be, but rather because we take the way things are as being God's activity. And if you take the way things are as being God's activity, you respect it for being God's activity, but you are also aware that God can do something different. So the attributing things to God and viewing things from God's perspective, I submit, is what allows us to thread this needle and essentially find something that's constant and unchanging, while also allowing for the most radical kind of changes. Why? Because what's unchanging is that the will of God. Everything is the will of God. So there's no difference between, say, a society with a certain order. I can't think of some, let's say, whatever kind of radical changes, let's say, society has undergone, okay? Let's say, feminism, race, take an example. Maybe. So, the role of women, right? So how do you deal with the, how does one deal with change without being fundamentally, without a sense of being, of stability, of rootedness being fundamentally undermined? The answer is, what are you rooted in? If you're rooted in this world, then there's no solution, no good solution. If this world is an outgrowth of another unknown world, which is constant, that's a constant. The fact that there's another world that's operating on this world, that's your constant. So therefore you simultaneously say, look, whatever is today, my neighbor who won't kill the mouse, that's a reality, so I respect that. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that it can't radically change, because everything down here is coming from up there. So that's why I maintain that seeing things from God's perspective is the ultimate, the most important, it's the key to having the perfect society that can respect the present and also be open to change. Yes?
So it's only as a means to help us deal with change?
Right, but here's the thing. So the question is the whole purpose of the Torah to help us deal with change?
Yeah.
Right, okay. So it's a very good question. The answer is as follows, that on a deeper level, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to hold off answering that question. Let's explore this further, but it's a great question. I certainly don't mean to say it's only that. So, but I think that further on this talk, we'll get an answer to that. So basically, through fearing God, we have a deep respect for what is, because everything is part of the divine plan. The way things are is part of the divine plan. At the same time, since fear of God means our understanding is limited, because we can never see things completely as God does, so we're open to progress, open to change, because everything is God's plan. Yes, question there?
Yeah. I just don't understand what role God plays in this. Take God out of it, everything can evolve. People's ideas evolve.
Right.
Laws evolve. People have more proclivity toward killing their children, and then
Right.
100 years later they don't.
Correct.
They don't believe in God, nothing to do with God.
Correct. Now, but there's a violence inherent to change. Let's talk about change, which is progress, which is a change for the better, okay? Because that's the kind of change we're interested in. There is always a violence that attends even a change for the better, because there are people that are reluctant and resistant to that change, okay? But that's what seeing things from God's perspective is supposed to open you up to. You don't see how?
The biggest zealots for conservatism are often God-fearing people.
Yes, 100%. Look, 100%. We mentioned at the beginning of the talk that the way I framed the question is, why should we think about God? Isn't that antisocial? And I mentioned that indeed thinking about God often makes us, often does lead people to be antisocial. one of the ways is, I guess is how you're saying, one of the ways is because they take what is to be reflective of God's will, and instead of what can be, which is a lot, which doesn't make any sense. There's no reason to take the particular way things are to be reflective of God's will, because you have to consider what can be in order to understand what God is doing, right?
But if I believe what can be now is inappropriate, then I'll blame that on God too. Is that
Right.
God doesn't change the equation at all.
God changes the equation because God opens me up to change.
Why does God open you up to change any more than it closes you off to change? And why does God...
Okay, so God misunderstood closes you to change. Okay, that's lots of things misunderstood. That's why we're here, because we need to understand God correctly, or else we're afraid that we're going to misunderstand and do the wrong thing. Otherwise, we wouldn't be learning. So the fact that some people misunderstand the concept of God and therefore they're not open to change doesn't interest me.
What's the concept of God that dictates that there must be change?
So the concept of God thinks about change like this. The reality is that there's change. Okay, take God out of the picture. Take the God idea out of the picture. There is change. In other words, what does that mean? People change, A, and B, it's a good thing that we can change because there are things that we want to improve. Right? That's all I'm saying. Things we want to improve. We don't want there to be suffering. We don't want. Okay, maybe that's a good example. Right? Should women suffer during childbirth? Now, don't quote. Genesis that says women should suffer. Forgetting that pasuk for a second, okay? Should women suffer during childbirth? So some people would say, no, we certainly want to make childbirth into a pain-free experience, right? But other people would be disturbed by the fact that the pain that's suffered through childbirth is so much a part of our life experience that we don't want to change things so much. And I think that's something that people would, even if they wouldn't articulate it, because it's like, really, you want them to suffer? People would feel that way, right? Why? Because you have a sense of stability rooted in the way things are, because you take the way things are as the way things should be. Now, that's nature, right? Everyone bridges the what is gap, as we discussed last week. People always take what is as the way things ought to be. Now, what the question is, how do you define what is? If you define what is as God's will, then, and you say, okay, God's will is that they should suffer, but God can also eat just as much will. God could theoretically just as much will that they don't suffer. And therefore, if there's the possibility for them not to suffer in childbirth, you should not feel bound to the reality that currently do suffer in childbirth. That shouldn't make you reluctant to change that, because since that's only an expression of God's will. And being an expression of God's will means it's subject to change, because God's will is something unfathomable. In other words, we don't know necessarily why he wants that now and what he'll want tomorrow. Therefore, things can apparently change in very important ways, but in a deepest sense, they actually stay the same, because you're still going with God's will. Okay, not convinced. All right, not convinced. I will say that there's an important idea that the Torah is, in fact, about unchanging things. Okay, because the law is immutable, and it's important that there be things that are literally unchanging. Okay, we could obviously give some examples of things that the law says are illegal and forbidden, and we don't change them. Okay, no, but one second, I'm saying so it is important that there be a certain kind of stability in a practical way also, so that we have something like an anchor.
Are you saying that based on what you're saying, are you saying that any progress is automatically God's will?
No, I mean, I'm not saying that.
So then so then maybe God allows you to consider progress, but God doesn't.
Okay, so how do we figure out God's will? We have to figure out what's constant, right?
Are you saying God's will can change?
So no. So good, right, exactly. So now you just asked me like this. If God's will is nothing, because we never pin it down to anything, so then aren't we saying we don't know anything, so we didn't bridge the Ozet gap at all, right? So there has to be certain things that are constant, okay? Such as, we have to have a sense, let's say, we have to have certain things that are immutable, such as we have to have a belief, for some reason or another, that ultimately everything is going to end up with existence as opposed to non-existence, let's say, that the world won't end, right? We have to have some reason to believe that. And then we say God favors existence. So I agree, there has to be some base base level. But the base level, being rooted in another world, allows for a lot more variation than a kind of sense of being, sense of realness that's not rooted in another world. Okay? And to the question that was asked before, though, about is this just a fix or is it something more deeper? Like I said, we'll get to that soon. So that's the point. So in other words, our belief or our faith, our sense of realness that's rooted in whatever it is that humans are up to is then connected with God's way. And we understand God's way is ongoing. There's always more to do. So I want to show this to you in a few different passages in the Rambam. One in Hilchos Deis and the other two in the guide. We'll get back to one of the passages we started with in the guide. Okay, so this one is in the first chapter of Hilchos Deis, where the Rambam teaches that we should find the golden mean. We discussed this. Everyone should find the average, the mean within each character trait. Okay. And that's how the Rambam carries on for the first 5 halachas in that first chapter. Doesn't say a word about Hashem, doesn't say a word about a mitzvah. He just gives you his ethics and tells you the best way to be. And as we discussed last week, this ethic seems to be rooted in societal need for conformity, essentially. But then the Rambam ends halacha hey and tells us that there's a commandment to follow in these good ways, which are the average, or the mean. As the pasuk says, "V'alachta b'drachav," you should go in the ways of God. Okay, so turns out that these ways are the ways of God. And he says that when the pasuk says that Avraham Avinu taught his children derech Hashem, the way of Hashem, this is what he's teaching them. Okay? Well, how is this the way of God? Why is this the way of God? The Rambam does not begin by saying, let's observe God. And by observing God, I'll show you that he takes the middle of the road. And because God does that, humans should do that. It's not what he says. It's a humanist chapter, a human-centered chapter, much as the guide that we used to jump into the human-centered position was all about the fact that humans have to get along. Here too, in Hilchos Deis, Rambam says, it's right that everyone should be Beinoni, not extreme. And then he brings it to God and says there's a commandment about this, which is to go in the ways of God, and this is called the way of God. So how is this the way of God? So the answer now, I think we have a better perspective on understanding this, that taking the ways of humans and finding a law within the variability, which is the human way, or human ways, turning it into a law, is bringing it back to God. Because instead of taking the brute reality of the fact that there are all different kinds of people and saying, listen, that's just the way it is, there's nothing to do about it, and it's chaotic, we instead try to make order out of it and try to view humanity as a function of a law. Okay, you see what I'm saying? That the creation of law, the way that we started with the guide Perplex 240, where he says, okay, why do we need law? Because there are different kinds of people and we have to make them conform. So now I'm telling you that what I see in the Hilchos Deis is that this is not just a utilitarian kind of calculation, that it's important to have law because that way people will get along. But rather, creating laws enables us to view humanity in its diversity as a function of God's law, function of a law. So instead of taking just a bunch of various data points, let's say, can we make a system that makes all these data points coherent? And the answer is yes, we can. And that system is called the Derech HaMamutza, the way of the golden mean. Because then we could look at humanity and say there's like a law. There's a law of nature, which is to say God's action. And that law of nature is called the middle road around which all of humanity is straddles that middle road, and they can notice that, and by noticing that law, they'll make laws and become a law, which is the way of God, because God acts through laws. So you see that these ways are the ways of God, not because God taken in and of himself acts in that way. In fact, there is no such thing as God taking in and of himself without the humans, which I'll show you even more explicitly now. That's a meaningless thing. It's not only meaningless because humans are a part of God's work, but more importantly, humans are the most important part of God's work. So to talk about God's ways and say like, okay, human beings like a priori making no assumptions, I just want to do what God does. Like, God does nothing more than you. So there is no way for you to take yourself out of the picture. And that's what Rambam is saying over here. He starts with a human-centered governance, but then he takes it back to Hashem, because humans, by dreaming, by coming up with this idea called law, that is a way of bringing themselves back to God and making their way a function of God. So what we want to achieve with this is that instead of bringing God down to us, let's say, to where humans are at, we want to recognize that human beings themselves are a function of God's actions, and that, as I've been saying, that's what allows us to transcend wherever we're at and be open to even transcending it further. Okay, I will say this idea about change is not something I think the Rambam holds of. I think the Rambam would say mostly what we're talking about tonight, but in a different way. He would say, if we're not capable of recognizing that there's something outside of us, we're going to tend to have too much respect for the body as such. So that's where when I'm talking about change between the current and the future, the Rambam would talk about in the present, at any given point in time. You can't only focus on humans, because you'll end up basically being self-centered and not caring about ideals. So you have to be able to come out of your own perspective. But I'm taking that to mean it's important to be able to come out of our own perspective, because as human beings, even as perfect human beings, we're always going to be going through changes. Now, the Rambam further says, it's an amazing thing, this is in Deis 1 Halacha Vav. He says that when the prophets called God patient, kind, righteous, etc., that is lohoidia she'elu drachim tovim v'yisharim heim. They call him that in order to tell us that those ways are good, v'chayev odom lahanik atzim v'hem, and that a person has to act that way. So the Rambam is making an amazing statement. He's saying that when the prophets call God righteous and merciful, that's a pedagogical tool. They're doing that to teach humans something. What? That we should act that way. Now, it's a very interesting statement, because what do you mean? Don't the prophets tell us something about God? The answer is yes, but they tell us something about God perceived through his actions, which is dependent on humans. So therefore, when the human tells us that God is merciful, you know what he means to say? If you take this message to heart and start acting merciful, then my message about God will be true. So why is the prophet calling God merciful? Why doesn't he call God cruel and thereby inspire people to be cruel? And his prophecy will be the same self-fulfilling prophecy as it is if he calls God merciful. The answer is because he wants people to be merciful. So the prophet calls God this because the purpose in naming God as merciful is because that way people will be merciful and the prophecy will be self-fulfilling. Now, does that mean then that the prophecy is completely conjured out of thin air, right? How does it all start? That we're not going to discuss today. Like, is the prophet just fooling people by saying God is merciful? Really, he's not. He's only merciful if people are inspired by Isaiah, who said he's merciful. And Isaiah could have just as much convinced us that God is cruel, and we would have been cruel, and he would have said, see, God is cruel because look, everyone is cruel. The whole humanity is running amok. So that's a question, which I'm not going to answer at this point. And it's a very important question. Extremely important question, obviously. But the point I'm bringing out is that the Rambam says that the prophets call God by the terms that they do as a means of teaching human beings. The Rambam is thereby implying that, as we've been saying the whole time, you can't say something about God unless human beings have that within themselves, because ultimately God's actions depend on human actions. Okay, and now I want to read a passage to you in the guide 354. This is one of the more famous contradictions in the guide. And I maintain that this is essentially the same discussion that we're having here. The Rambam, in the last and final chapter of the guide, he talks about the various kinds of perfection that a human being can have, and there are 4 kinds of perfection. The first kind of perfection is to have many possessions. And that's not really perfection because that's not you, that's something external to yourself. The second one is for a person to have health. Okay, so that's at least your body, but it's still no great perfection, okay? The third kind of perfection, which is what we mentioned last talk, is perfection of the moral virtues. But that's not something that's for the person himself, because if you would be yourself on a desert island, there would be no need to perfect your moral virtues. It's only about the other. You're only doing it for another person. Okay, important, right? That's not interesting. Moral virtues. The fourth species of perfection, I'll read this inside, is the true human perfection. It consists in the acquisition of the rational virtues. I refer to the conception of intelligibles, which teach true opinions concerning the divine things. Okay? So what is true human perfection? To know the truth about the divine things. This is in true reality the ultimate end. This is what gives the individual true perfection, a perfection belonging to him alone. You ought to desire to achieve this thing, okay? Not moral perfection, but intellectual perfection, which is to say, understand intelligibles, true opinions concerning divine things. The Rambam explains then that the pasuk in Yirmiyah, which says, "Let not the wise man glory in his wisdom, nor the mighty man glory in his might, not let the rich man glory in his riches, but let him that glory in it," that he understands that Nomi is going through these 3 levels of perfection. Okay? So that's the pasuk, Al Yishalel Chacham b'chachmasai, Yishal Gibar b'gvurasai, Yishal Osher ba'oshrei. Only thing a person should be proud of is knowledge of God. So he says the first 3 levels, wisdom, wealth, and might, correspond to the 3 things he discussed earlier, because wisdom means character virtue, okay? The only thing a person should be proud of is knowledge. Haskel v'yadoya oisi. And the end of the pasuk is, know me, for I am Hashem who does kindness, justice, and righteousness in the earth. And that's the Rambam continues and says the following. As we have mentioned this verse, and the wondrous notions contained in it, once I mention this verse, I will complete the exposition of what it concludes. For when explaining in this verse the noblest ends, he does not limit them only to the apprehension of him who may be exalted. The pasuk does not say, says the Rambam, that a person should understand God, or understand that I am one, or that I have no figure, or that there is none like me, or something similar. But he says, the pasuk says, that one should glory in the apprehension of myself, God, and in the knowledge of my attributes, by which it means his actions, because the pasuk ends and says, I am Hashem who does loving kindness, judgment, and righteousness in the earth. So the Rambam makes the point over here that the highest level is not knowing things about the divine, but it's knowing things about his actions. And here he says something which seems to conflict, outright contrary to what he said earlier. Thus, the end that he sets forth in this verse may be stated as follows. It is clear that the perfection of man that may truly be gloried in, so what is the true glory of man, the true perfection, is the one acquired by him who has achieved apprehension of him, God, and who knows his providence extending over his creatures, as manifest in the act to bring them into being and their governance as it is. So while the Rambam earlier said that the highest perfection of man is to know truths about the divine, here the Rambam says the perfection of man is to know truths about the divine and how it interacts with the world. The way of life of such an individual, after he has achieved this apprehension, will always have in view chesed, mishpat, tzedakah, loving kindness, righteousness, and judgment, through assimilation to his actions. So the highest level of perfection of man, says the Rambam, is that he should learn God's ways and emulate God. So which one is it? And to put it another way, he says that the third level of perfection, which is character virtue, is only for yourself. Is only for others. It's not for yourself. And therefore you should think about it perfecting your intellect. But then when he reiterates the idea of perfecting your intellect, he adds the prophet does not say just to perfect your intellect. It says to understand that God manages the world, and you'll do the same thing. So now we seem to be back to the moral virtues, which originally were not held up as the highest perfection of man. So I think the answer is that there's actually no contradiction. Once we think about the way of man, which is to say the realm of moral virtues, of character virtues, once we understand that as God's ways and part of God, the law about God, then we emulate that. Then we are inspired by that, the same way we're inspired, the same way our greatest knowledge is something about God and His essence, as being one or not being a body. Then, once we understand a law of God that He created humans with their characteristics, once we transcend the human perspective and think about it from God's perspective, then that becomes a godly matter. So while the Rambam, so put it this way, the Rambam at one point said, when he's quoting the philosophers, he says, okay, you could have money, you could have health, you could have good character, but that you don't need good character, your neighbor does. Or you could have knowledge about God. Okay? Once we get to the prophets who teach us about God, and they teach us that God is the one that makes good character, because He's the one who does chesed, mishpat, tzedakah. He's the one who is sent prophets to teach that He is merciful and therefore make people merciful, and that's what makes Him merciful. So once we know that about God, then when I emulate God, I am not only doing something for my neighbor, I'm living up to the highest law of reality. So from the philosopher's perspective, it is truly a matter of utility. But from the perspective of the prophet, who recognizes the impetus within humanity to make peace with their neighbors, to be kind, which is a human impulse based on the fact that humans live in society. Yes, that's where it comes from, within the realm of nature. But they take the realm of nature and say, with this whole nature, this is all God's law. But once you see the world from the perspective of the prophets, then you incorporate whatever's into human nature and fold that all into what God is doing. And then it becomes something worth doing because God is doing it and you're being godlike. So those are the two steps in the Rambam. And with this, I will go back to the chapter we started with, past that volume. So that's volume 2, chapter 40, which is the one we started this whole discussion with, where the Rambam says that man is political by nature, and it is nature to live in society, plus there's manifold composition of the species, there's all different types of people, and there's great difference between humans, plus we live in society, so therefore we need a ruler. Okay? So Rambam begins this chapter by saying, I need law because we have to figure out a way to make people get along. And then he says this cryptic statement, which I mentioned in the last talk, where he says, therefore I say that the law, that is the Torah, although it is not natural, enters into what is natural. So is the law natural or not? So he says, sort of. Why sort of? Because within nature, there's this thing called legislation. And it's part of nature because it's a necessary part of nature, because nothing in nature is there for no reason. It's a necessary part of nature because human beings have this problem. And the solution is legislation, law. So law is part of nature, and the law, the Torah, it's not natural, but it has a connection to what's natural. So what is that? Well, which one is it? So further in this chapter, in 240, in volume 2, chapter 40, he tells us how to distinguish between a divine law and a man-made law. And the Rambam says that a law which is made purely to order society. If you find a law, so let's say take American law, the whole end of which and the whole purpose of it are directed towards the ordering of the city, the polis, and of its circumstances and the abolition of injustice and oppression. If the whole purpose of the law is we want to have an ordered city, we don't want to have injustice and oppression. And if in that law attention is not at all directed towards speculative matters, no heed is given to the perfecting the rational faculty, and no regard is accorded to opinions being correct or faulty, the whole purpose of that law being, on the contrary, the arrangement, in whatever way this may be brought about, of the circumstances of the people in relation with another. Okay? If the law is only concerned with making people get along, and there being no strife and oppression and injustice, noble as that is, but however that can be done, that's what the law wants to achieve, then you should know that law is a nomos, meaning to say it's a law promulgated by a legislator who is not a prophet. It's not from God. If, on the other hand, you find a law, all of whose ordinances are due to attention being paid to the soundness of the circumstance pertaining to the body and also to the soundness of belief, a law that takes pains to inculcate correct opinions with regard to God and with regard to the angels, and that desires to make man wise, that guidance is from God. So notice that the Rambam began this chapter by saying that the purpose of law is to order society. And in fact, that is a major function of the Torah. And the Rambam talks about the reason for the commandments, that's a major function. But there's a dual function of the Torah. The Rambam reiterates that too in volume 3, which is that the Torah, besides for wanting to order society, also wants to teach you truths about God. And apparently those two things go together. Okay, which is just an interesting thing about the Torah. Like, what is the Torah about? Does the Torah want you to return something you find because that's a good way to order a city? Or does the Torah want you to know truths about God? Well, clearly the Torah wants you to know both. But how do those two things belong in one book? But that's what the Rambam is doing in this same chapter. And this, I maintain, is the very combination that we've been talking about today, and that's that the Rambam is doing in the last chapter. Because a law that's sole interest is ordering humanity and will do it however it can, is not from God. That's not a God law. What's new in the Torah, what makes it divine, is that the Torah says we're going to combine the order of human society with a God perspective. That's what's new, that's what's different about the law of the prophets from the law of the philosophers. And that's essentially what we've been talking about till now, about seeing things from God's perspective. Seeing things from God's perspective means if you want to be able to transcend what human beings are, I'm adding at the present moment, and realize that there's always going to be something greater, something different that we can achieve, then we have to be able to view the world from God's perspective. Say everything that we have today, in other words, the way humans are, and therefore the way we want humans to have to get along, that is God, and because that is God, therefore we're going to respect it while simultaneously recognizing that can be something new. Okay, so I want to just ask whether you feel that I got back to your question here. So the question, right? Well, no, the question was whether this is all as a means of us being able to change.
It's actually.
The answer is we want to be on God's side.
Check.
Well, it does. So it does. Because, so why don't I just say, so let's go like this. Why don't I just answer the original question and say, of course we want to be on God's team. Isn't that obvious? The answer is because, sort of when I started the talk, that, well, aren't we humans? Like, well, you can't just decide you're not going to be a human. So we have to bridge that gap. In other words, what I mean to say is we have to be able to be on the team of God while also getting there through normal human structures. Okay? That's why philosophy, that's why the Rambam insists that we have to think about the philosophical aspect. We can't just say, well, there's a divine law and we don't need philosophy anymore, because that's basically saying we are turning our back on our humanity, and that won't work. That will lead to what you described and all sorts of problems that happen when people aren't human, don't respect the humanity. So ultimately, we do want humans to be on God's team. As we mentioned, let's say in the first talk, I said Torah wants humans to be a race of angels. Yeah, sure, that's awesome. But that's what change means, essentially. The end point of change is that we're going to be as godly as possible. Okay? Maybe we'll upload our consciousness and come visit our bodies and whatever, and do all sorts of cool stuff, like angels do, or like Eliyahu Navi does, you know? That's being like God, being with God. That's what it means. But since that's a major change from where we are today, the Torah guides us to there by saying, take where you are today, and at the same time, know that you're going to be constantly transcending to a higher level. Okay? So essentially the answer to your question is, it's not just like a self-help book. It's not just a good idea. It's actually the ultimate perfection of humanity, for them to be able to see things as God, of course. Sure. But that's not just a pat, simple answer, because the way we get there has to work through normal psychological rules. And that's why I was looking at it from here. Okay? Well, these are my thoughts. Obviously, I don't mean to. Even if I think this, I'm not even 100% sure this is right from as I see it. But even if I was, that wouldn't matter. Of course, you're welcome to think about this. I think it's definitely intriguing intriguing way of thinking, and we shall leave it at that. Should we cut the tape?